Hi there, everyone. I'm Tracy Matisak, and I'm here with Bob Sandow. Bob is our special guest for Humanities on the Road taping of Deserter Country. The program is all about Civil War dissent, and particularly as it relates to people in the lumber regions in the Appalachians of Pennsylvania. It is fascinating stuff and little known history. Bob, give us a little preview. Tell us what we can expect from the program.
Well, the idea of the unknown history of the Civil War is really the focus of this talk because everyone's so familiar, especially those who live in Gettysburg or in Pennsylvania who know about Gettysburg. They're familiar with battles and leaders and the military exploits of the war. But I was drawn to what's called homefront studies, things that happened to people at home and how they endured the war and how it had affected them. And my own work led me to sort of study these stories, and I was drawn to these notions of the Civil War as a war with a great deal of opposition. And I think that's an unknown section of the war, and so that's really the point of tonight's talk.
You are an associate professor of history at Lock Haven University. Tell us how you came to zero in on this particular area of Pennsylvania.
Good question. Well, like all graduate students, you reach a point where you have to choose a topic for yourself, and you have to find something that you love because you're going to be with it for a while, researching and writing. And so for me, I stumbled upon this not through a Civil War class, but through a class on Vietnam, where a major theme of that course was, of course, the widespread opposition during Vietnam. And there was a book I was reading that actually made some small parallels and sort of suggestive things that the Civil War also had similar themes to it. And it was something that I was not familiar with, even though I felt I was pretty well versed in Civil War history. And so that pushed me in the direction of trying to uncover this. And in the end, I found out that even here in Pennsylvania, there's a tremendously rich story about opposition during the war. So I didn't have to go very far afield to find the evidence I needed.
And you found enough to write a whole book about it.
Yes, yes. And at first I was skeptical, and so was my advisor. In fact, my first clues toward this were actually based on very small fragments of records that you can find in some published histories of the war. And so since there wasn't much written about it, I didn't know where the story would lead. But the more I researched and the more I read, the more I realized that there is a depth of information here. And so it ended up being a book.
Well, and there are still commemorations going on in various locations of the dissent going on around the wars. Tell us about some of that and what we might be able to learn from some of those commemorations.
Sure. Well, what's interesting is, of course, after the war, communities and individuals who had opposed the war mostly were silent about it, and families who knew that that members of their own family had opposed the war or refused to serve, it was something of a social stigma. And so, in the immediate aftermath of the war, most people didn't talk about those things, and for many generations, these stories were often hidden or sort of passed down secretively. But now we're far enough removed from the war itself, I think, that people can understand the multiple perspectives on the war, that there were people who opposed the war as well as supported it. And so now people are attempting to recapture their own community and family history. And so what we find is that communities that are learning about this are beginning to maybe celebrate isn't necessarily the right word, but to commemorate, to remember, and to talk about the difficulties. And so, for instance, the subject of my book was in Clearfield County, and one of the great episodes in my work deals with a confrontation between federal authorities and resistors to the draft. And they've actually reenacted that and put up a historic plaque and turned that site into one of their community parks. So they've embraced the idea that it's a part of their past. And that's been happening in other places too. In Columbia County recently, they dedicated a plaque. And so communities are coming to grips with the fact that this was a complicated war with many narratives.
You are a Commonwealth speaker with the Pennsylvania Humanities Council, and as such, you've had a lot of opportunities to speak with audiences and share this information. Tell us a little bit about your experience being a speaker and sharing this with people around Pennsylvania.
Well, what I find is that generally, no matter where I go, I get a similar reaction that people are very fascinated to learn that these things happened, and often in their own backyards. And so they tend to ask lots of questions about this, the extent of opposition, what it meant. And more often than not, they also point out to the realization that there are parallels between the Civil War era and today, as we are a nation engaged in war, and we still struggle with the idea of what's the proper role of a citizen in time of war. Where do we draw the lines between individual rights and the needs of the nation? And so we still find that a very timely debate. And so when I show the parallels to the Civil War era, that's something that naturally brings up contemporary circumstances as well.
Well, those are exactly the kinds of things that we'll be talking about in our taping of Humanities on the Road, Deserter Country. It will be a fascinating program, really interesting information that I'll bet you probably didn't know about the Civil War. We'll be with Bob Sandow, and he will be educating us on all of that, so we hope you can join us for that. We'll see you next time.